This is We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling, where I give you the tools and the skills that you need to love better so you can live better. What happens when the rules we've all been taught about keeping passion alive get turned upside down? Today, we're diving into a conversation that just might challenge everything you thought you knew about intimacy. My guest is Michaela Boehm, an intimacy coach whose approach has helped countless couples and several A-list celebrities rediscover connection and passion. But some of her ideas are fairly controversial. Today, we'll explore what Michaela recommends instead of the traditional intimacy playbook, and how anyone, regardless of their relationship status, can take the first steps towards building stronger, more fulfilling connections. So whether you're navigating your own relationship or you're simply curious about how intimacy thrives in today's world, this conversation will leave you inspired to rethink what's possible and what might be holding you back. So let's get into it. Michaela, thank you so much for joining me. What is an intimacy coach?
Well, I love that question so much when I saw it, because there's no actual metrics for an intimacy coach. And I don't actually consider myself an intimacy coach, but other people call me an intimacy coach. But I think it's a great thing to look at, because that word is thrown around a lot. And also, then we know about intimacy coordinators on the movies, which is a totally different thing. But it all gets somewhat muddled together. Why I have been called an intimacy coach is that I work on the intersection of embodiment and relationship, and that intersection is intimacy. And so meaning the work that I do essentially centers around all the psychological aspects of what has to happen in a relationship, brought into the body, because the body really is our vehicle of intimacy or vehicle of connection. We can talk about how could we define intimacy or not, but the body is the vehicle of connection. And if the body doesn't have the muscles, and I'm making quotes here, they're muscles, emotional muscles, also physical muscles, habit patterns, skills, then our interactions with other people, as well as interactions with ourselves, are greatly condensed or reduced or even constricted.
What drew me to you is some of your unconventional ways of seeing issues in relationships and disseminating specific suggestions for enhancing intimacy. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting is that you've said that date night comes with a lot of pressure. Why have you said that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things why some people consider it unconventional is that anything you hear me say, I've tested out, not only therapeutically, but also myself and with all the people I teach in workshops. So when I say something, it sometimes sounds quite like counterintuitive or something, but I think, and you know this because this is your field as well, right? That a lot of advice given to couples is aspirational and not practical.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning somebody thinks that's a good idea and then essentially doubles down on that as an almost dogmatic idea of what should work. And if it's not working, it's because the client does it wrong or the student does it wrong, not because it's not the right kind of advice. Mm-hmm. And so date night is one of these classic situations where we could say there's almost ideological pressure, right, to do it right, so to speak. But when we consider what date night is about, right, we have to consider that most people need to have date night because their lives they are a couple, right? There's people in thruples or whatever who also have to deal with this, but this is mostly two people have a life together. And doesn't matter which gender they are or sexual orientation, but two people have a life together, and that life makes it such that there is too much emphasis on getting stuff done and living the life, and not as much emphasis on cultivating a relationship that has a sexual or erotic component and, let's say, a romantic connective component. So when we prescribe date night, or when people go on date night, what they want is one of two things or both. And this is also, of course, a bit dicey. They want either a time of deep connection where they feel like they used to feel when they used to go on dates, and or they want to have a sexy time, you know. So, and of course, nothing is less sexy than when you've just had an enormous meal somewhere, right? But that's a whole other story, right? If you go for dinner and stuff. But so those are the objectives of date night. Now, for that to work, you have to essentially replicate the mechanisms of what made date night great at some point. And you also have to look at why is it that you have to schedule time for that, right? Of course, the answer for that is that most of us have the kind of life where spontaneous running, away to some performance, some spontaneous performance of somebody you saw advertising on the side of the road, whatever, right? Like some cool new adventurous thing doesn't just happen because you're scheduled, you have children, you have work, you have obligations. So there is no spontaneity. So you have to schedule time. But of course, anytime you schedule time, you are now suddenly just doing another thing that requires your attention.
But how is that different than in the beginning? Because arguably, if we start dating as an adult, we have a life, we have a schedule, we have obligations, and we still have to put forethought into. So yeah, please give me the distinction.
That's the $1 million question. And when you answer that question, you know how to do date night. So what happens when you meet someone and you go on a date first, right? So, and these are the ingredients of a good date night. And this is what sometimes people can't wrap their mind around. And I have this term called date night discipline that always messes people up. So what are the things that you do when you first meet somebody and you go on a date? Well, you plan the date. So both people agree on a time. That time's pretty much nobody's going to change that time, right? This is the first important thing. When you are with somebody in the very beginning, you're not ideally half an hour late, or you go, I can't do it right now. Can we do it tomorrow? You're like, oh no, this is the gospel, right?
Right.
This is our time together. I'm going to give this my very own. That's the first one, right? The next one is you prepare for it. Right? So whatever that means, you plan, you make reservations, you get waxed, you get scrubbed, you get whatever, right?
You do.
You do. You take a shower, you have special clothes. You don't plan anything else. In the beginning, now this might be a bit different, but in the olden days, right, you wouldn't be on your phone when you are with a new date. You give them undivided attention. And most importantly, when you go on a date with somebody new, there's very specific purpose to that time, and that is you want to get to know each other. And it's a very interesting dance between finding commonalities and also being thrilled by the other being different than you. And essentially,
and how does that change over time when we try to replicate that in a longer term relationship?
Well, I don't know if you've ever been there, but I certainly have been on occasion guilty of that. You lean on the commonalities to the point where there is no more, let's say, exploration or adventure or newness. And then furthermore, I'll explain there's a principle behind that. And then furthermore, you have no date night discipline, meaning you leak the rest of your life into your date, which you would never do in the beginning. With a new date, you don't sit down, you go, God, my boss, such an asshole. And, oh, did you buy milk? And did you pay the gas bill? And are you taking your dog to the vet tomorrow? You don't do that. You arrive, you're ready to go, you're interesting, you talk about stuff that's not ho-hum every day, what I call administrivia, right? And so what makes date night so horrendous for most people once they're in is they just extend their regular life to a restaurant or a movie theater or whatever, and
they wonder why it's not magical like it was in the beginning, because they don't have the discipline to not allow housekeeping to leak into this romance and seduction that's supposed to, this new kind of connection. You've left the house together, you're intended to connect differently. But if but it's like, we call it in addiction, pulling a geography. If the same person just moves to a different place and does the same things, they're going to replicate the same outcomes no matter where they go.
That is right. That's exactly how it is. Right?
I love the term date night discipline. I think that is a great term, and I'm going to start using it as well with my clients. So if somebody can be mindful in the way they approach a date night, and maybe less is more. Maybe it doesn't have to be a weekly thing. Maybe it's better to have it twice a month or once a month for it to be a little bit more reasonable to completely act as though you did in the beginning. Dial up your curiosity. But is what you're saying that most people aren't able to do that, and so they replicate in a restaurant the same things that happened at home, and then they wonder why nobody can get it up, kind of metaphorically or literally. Is that right?
Right. Yes, that's one of the issues. One of the issues is if you just drag the rest of your day into that is not going to be exciting. The other thing is that if you do spend a lot of time with somebody day in and day out, you don't have a lot of interesting new things to say. And so you've heard all the stories, you've heard all the complaints, you've heard all the old stories. So it will actually require that you become an interesting person again. And
yes.
People do this, of course, for when they get divorced and now they have to go out there on the dating market. Suddenly they become interesting again. You can become interesting for your partner, but it will actually require that you take a little bit of time and think about something that you could bring to your partner that they find interesting. Now, some people, it's very intellectual. They go, oh, I want to tell her about this article I've read. Typically not the most exciting thing, unless two people share just some really, But what typically works is, in England, there's a saying, a change is as good as a rest. So what typically works is if you don't go to the same restaurant, you do something different. You make an effort in creating an environment that is substantially different in stimulation than your usual, that the conversation will follow or the action will follow. And so I'm a big, big fan of people researching things to do that are slightly not what they usually do.
Yeah.
Or that they haven't done in a long time and they used to do and found very enjoyable. Either of those works. And so then, of course, that brings out other parts of the person that you're with and other parts in you, and so on and so on. So that's one way to play with it. The other way to play with it is essentially doing things that are very specifically planned, where one person does something for the other. So, where people say, okay, tonight's my night. And then it can go both ways. You can either say, I'm going to do things for you that I know you really enjoy as a gift, regardless of how I'm feeling about them. Mm-hmm. Or you say, I'm going to make you do things. This is, of course, strictly consensual between consensual adults in a good relationship, right? But where you play around with, okay, I'm going to take you on a ride of things that you might not want to usually plan, but it's going to be fun, right? Of course, there has to be a veto if something doesn't feel safe and all of that. I'm going to take that as a given amongst adults, right?
Yes.
But you could do either way, and then you have play, right? Then you have proper play. friend of mine recently, I had a bit of a thing with her husband, like it got a bit stale. And I suggested that she dress him up. She go somewhere with him. They went to a thrift store, so it was easy. And she bought him an outfit that she thought he should wear, that he would never wear. And, they bought the entire thing. And like in where I live, they have these hipster thrift stores. And then they went somewhere where they kind of role played a certain thing. And it's completely revitalized their whole idea of what they should do with each other. Now he's going to do it with her next, where they go and he dresses her up the way he thinks she should go out with him and stuff. So there's all kinds of ways where you take it out of, okay, I know we should connect, and you make it kind of fun.
Yeah, I love that. You have said that casual touching is actually bad for the sexual spark over time. Why is that?
Well, it's a longer conversation that has to do with creating opposition. And what I mean with creating opposition, we can go there later, but just to answer your question, when we are not the same, meaning when we're individuals with individual things going on, which is what that excitement and spark plays on, it's the attraction of opposites, right?
Yeah.
You can say that essentially sexual spark functions on kind of opposites attract, or two poles that are opposite, create a spark. That's what the spark is, the hotness. And similarity makes for good relationship because you have common values and goals. But what makes you good in relationship, meaning you can agree, you have common values, you can communicate, you have things going on that are can be resolved through having reasonable conversation. That's the thing that kills the spark, because you don't have any opposition. And so touching all the time in this like kind of, somewhat random way makes it so the body is no longer feeling a spike of arousal. And when I'm talking arousal, I'm not talking sexual arousal, but nervous system arousal, right?
You become desensitized
completely.
is what happens. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, completely. You become desensitized to the partner as somebody who gives you that jolt, that spark.
So they no longer have that heightened sensitivity and that nervous system reactivity. And
so it's that simple, right? It's not very controversial. It's just the way it goes. And this gets particularly exacerbated when women have young children who constantly touch them and hang on them. Right?
I have heard about that. I have friends and I have colleagues who have spoken about touch overload, like they don't want to be touched anymore.
That's right. So then you come from a day like that and constant like little petting or rubbing the other's back or something like that. And now you're supposed to feel aroused by a partner, or at least, enlivened by a partner. And that's not going to happen, right? And there's like a fine art to allowing a person to resensitize to sensation outside of that. And one of the ways you do it is you give them a bit of space. You don't constantly rub them and touch them. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm in a workshop and in a couples workshop, or even when I still used to see couples on a couch, right? When people hold hands or rub each other a lot, you will hear inevitably that their sex life is suffering. Because
so interesting,
right? You know that, right? It's like it's always the people.
But it's an oxymoron for me, and it's very counterintuitive. But I kind of get it. But I'm so not hardwired that way. I can't fathom a scenario in which there was too much touch. I can't fathom it. I can't even. It's very rare that I haven't experienced a struggle that a client, a student, or society at large has struggled with. This is one that I truly can't personally relate to. I cannot fathom feeling overwhelmed by touch. So what is this specific type of casual touch that we should minimize, and for how long, in order to reset our nervous systems so that we can once again become responsive and have all those great feelings that we felt in the beginning when our partners touch us?
Yeah, well, you're lucky, number one,
I don't know. It's never enough. It's never enough. I mean, I don't know if my wife would say that I'm lucky, but maybe, because maybe, I mean, that would probably suck for her if I did. I was like, no.
Yeah. So I would say the thing to remember is that the overload isn't just a touch overload. It's a general nervous system overload. So it's noise, it's TVs, it's
Oh, that I can relate
demand.
to. Yes, I can totally relate to that.
Yeah, and touch is just one sense, right? So sensory overload can be too much visual, too much auditory, too much taste, too much smell, too much touch. And so typically what happens is some people have senses that are higher on the demand and senses that are lower on the demand. So if your sense of touch, if you can enjoy a lot of touch, there's probably other senses where you are way more sensitive, right? So for instance, I'm hyper visual and I have photographic memory. So for me, visual overload happens really, really fast. Like really, really fast. But touch overload barely ever happens as well, right? But visual overload immediately. When I'm stressed, auditory overload immediately. When I get auditory overload, I also don't want to be touched anymore, or visual overload, because my entire sensory system is taxed. So
I'm gonna ask you a clarifying question here, and I don't know if I'm at all on the right track or if I'm completely off track, but I remember during COVID, when I was wearing a mask all the time, I became very sensitive to visual stimulation and auditory stimulation. And is that at all what you're talking about here?
yes. So in the nervous system, in the body systems, when one sense is restricted, the other senses pick up the slack. That is why a lot of people who are not sighted, in a conventional way, have a lot more touch or sound capacities. And that's also, of course, what people use when they want to erotically play. If you take somebody's sight away, they get much more sensitive to their touch and stuff like that, because the sensory system is essentially the system of keeping us alive in the world as a, like, say, Paleolithic creature, right? If one of your senses wasn't working, you were dead, essentially. You could taste, you didn't know if you ate something. Nobody had prepared your food, right? You only could survive if you knew that something was poisonous before you swallowed it, and so on, right? So our sense system is such that there's an immediate picking up of the senses one place when the other one's lacking or missing or temporarily disabled. Right? So when you wear a mask, an interesting thing happens, of course, is that all of us, right? And this is also what made people so angry and gnarly and everything, right? It's like, if you can no longer orient visually towards social cues, which is what keeps you safe, right? You have to go into an overdrive to somehow compensate for the lack of the visual cue. So then what that typically meant for a lot of people was that they became more aware. This is not exactly one of the five senses, but it fits into it goes into that category. So they became hypersensitive to the fluctuations of people. Once you become hypersensitive to the fluctuations of people, you of course feel everything, and so on, right? So that is why that happened during COVID a lot. And a lot of people got very angry when they could no longer read people.
Yes.
And I remember once going into a store and asking this woman a question, and the way she came at me was so jarring. But I realized that she couldn't read social cues. She didn't read my smile, of course, right? And so she completely misinterpreted what I said. And so this also plays into when we now talk about date night and not touching. When you have whole sets of overload in your daily life, you have kids, or you have a demanding job, and then you commute, and then all of those kind of things, your entire sense system is already essentially having to desensitize to function. Now, when your partner touches you, you can't actually feel much of it already. Or if it's the kind of touch that kind of jars you because you're already overloaded, then you actually have a flinch response.
Yes.
Right? That can happen, and I've seen it happen. And so then, of course, that gets programmed every day, all day into your body. Now you go out, now you're supposed to have a romantic time, and when your partner touches you, all of that loads up.
Support for this episode comes from Mindful Care. Right now, it feels like the cracks in our society have grown deeper. Political polarization, economic uncertainty, and constant stress can leave anyone feeling stuck. Mindful Care offers same-day access to expert clinicians and personalized treatments to help you feel like yourself again. And they accept all types of insurance, so support is just a call or a text away. Contact Mindful Care at 516-505-7200 or visit mindful.care to book your appointment today. If we want to reset our nervous system from casual touch, is there some basic formula or rule to try out and maybe scale up or down depending on how well or unwell it works for you?
Yes, I mean, the most basic form is don't touch your partner unless you mean to touch them with a purpose in a, let's say, erotic sexual situation, right? So in an ideal world, if you want to have a bit of a different kind of romantic erotic time, let's just say you only have an evening, right? And the kids are somewhere else, or maybe you don't have children, but you finally have like an evening when nobody's working and stuff like that. And now you say, right, because you've made a date night, you've said, we haven't really connected that well for a while, or I miss X and whatever. And so you make a plan. That would be the ideal scenario amongst adults, right? You go, hey, we haven't really done much. Not like, you never give me time, but hey, we haven't done much. Let's set the evening aside, let's make a plan. And then from that moment on, you step back and you pretend that you are actually dating this person freshly, right? Mm-hmm. And that means you don't spend time together till it's time to have your date. So maybe you spend an hour or two in separate rooms, right? Or somebody goes for a walk and somebody has a bath. Different people need different things to replenish their system, right? But you get to spend time alone. You spend time in nature. Like I said, you have a bath, you put on some music and you dance. Maybe you'll cook something nice in the kitchen without constantly checking your texts, all of the things that actually de-escalate you. And then when you come back together, you actually put your phones away, if that's at all still possible.
Yeah, I think I want to believe that our listeners can after they listen to the podcast.
Yeah, and there's ways to do that. Then people always say to me, but what about when the nanny calls? Well, you have everything blocked except the nanny. I mean, there's ways around this, right?
Of course there are.
Yeah. I just found out there's this box that you can buy. It's actually for food. It's like the most... Yes. So it's like a food lock box where you can lock your food away from yourself, I guess. You could lock your phone away, but, of course, then if the nanny calls, but whatever. A landline, maybe,
That only she has the phone number to.
That's right. Exactly. Or whatever, right? Like, I mean, I would hope people still have enough wherewithal to prioritize their relationship. Otherwise, they wouldn't be listening, probably. But
probably not.
But then what you do is you don't touch randomly. You only touch with purpose, right? So, for instance, one of the ways that you could do it is I'm making this up. These are my own preferences, probably. But let's just say you've made a little picnic in the backyard, and it's a nice balmy evening, and you enjoy a nice glass of frosted rosé and whatever, right? Like some oysters, or we could be much more Doritos, whatever.
You're cheating with the oysters because you know that there's a research study that says that if a couple eats oysters together, because most of us don't eat them all the time, to come full circle on your point that sensory overload desensitizes us. So if you eat oysters together, there's some wildly high statistical probability that you're going to have sex that night. So you're cheating with the oyster suggestion. Let's use Doritos instead. They're not sponsoring us, but we'll use them instead.
Well, maybe not quite Doritos, but something that you really enjoy. And the reason I said Doritos and oysters, of course, is that savory, somewhat spicy foods, as foods that have an unusual texture, are once again new, right? What you want to do is new all along the way, right? Things that are slightly different. You usually drink one wine, get another one. You usually use one kind of potato chip, get another one, right? Get out of the rut of the thing. But you could blindfold your partner and then say, give me your hand, right? And then when they reach out their hand, then you take their hand, and you take their hand not in this casual, slightly sweaty palm, rubbing thing, but you actually really take their hand. And maybe you rub their hand for a moment, right? And you squeeze it or something. You do something different. And then you really allow for your hand and their hand to have contact in a meaningful way. And they're blindfolded, and you're going, we're going to go down a step. I'm going to touch your side. I'm going to hold you there, right? And you put their attention on the sensory experience of touch in a conscious way. That's very different than just like shuffling somebody along, right, without saying something. So there's many ways that you can do it, but the simplest way is to not touch unless you mean it.
Mm-hmm. And going back to your example of people in your audience of your workshops, that, when you can see couples touching casually, I often find that to be a nervous response.
That's what I mean. Those are typically people with the least sexual life, because it becomes that reassurance. Are you still there? Are you still there? Are you still there? There's this whole touchy-feely holding hand. People are not even aware of what they're doing. And if you can stop that, just even temporarily, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't touch ever and stuff like that. We're talking kind of as a lab to produce different results, so to speak. If you can just stop that very quickly, the body goes again, oh, this is nice, right? It doesn't take long. I'm not saying, don't touch each other for 3 weeks or something like that. It's quick.
We're talking days or hours.
Correct? We're talking hours, sometimes minutes, right? I mean, if you just are conscious around the stuff, then immediately the nervous system reacts differently.
I love that. I really do. And that really resonates with me. Another thing that you've said that has resonated with me is that you have encouraged partners to live apart. And I have never heard anyone echo that other than you. I have told people this for years, that and I don't want to kill your answer. I'll tell you my answer after you tell me yours, because I want to hear your answer. Why should we not live together? What's the benefit?
Well, let's just say it's not always not living together, because that's not feasible for a lot of people, right? So how this came about is that, of course, I have celebrity clients, mostly celebrity or very high-performing business people who have the wherewithal to have separate houses. But of course, not everybody has that wherewithal. It's also not advisable for all situations. But if you are in a long-term sustainable relationship, committed relationship, that you want to maintain let's say, an erotic charge and an enjoyable connection with your partner, then individuality is your best friend, right? Being different, doing different things, being still interesting, not always being around, not always rubbing off every last bit of charge between the two of you, right? And so one of the ways that's done is by spending time apart. And spending time apart could be separate houses, my ideal scenario, but I'll say more about that. Could be having each person having their own room with their own bed in it, let's say, right? Even potentially, so that you don't always have to be together, right? I'm definitely a big believer in not sleeping in the same bed all the time. I think that's for the same reasons. But even just having separate rooms in the same house, in a situation where you don't have enough income to have more than one bedroom, then spending a bit of time apart where one person goes away for a weekend or even just for an evening with friends or whatever. So being separated allows the coming back together to be much more enjoyable and also exciting, number one. But then, of course, when we look at living separately, if you get to actually be yourself all the time, you become much more tolerant of the other partner being themselves all the time. And your time together is probably spent not bickering or being annoyed or picking on each other for things that are just the annoyances of two individuals living in the same household and still trying to maintain a bit of individuality, which suddenly is an affront to the other partner, right? When they used to love it and stuff like that. So you can cut down on that by having some separation. Now, like I said, not everybody wants to go to separate houses. I've seen that work for a lot of people really well who were very good. Now, this is, meaning they had really good relationships. But even having a room, right? A woman's room of her own, right? There's a reason why there was a book, and the whole thing about that is there's still kind of an assumption that once you move in as a couple, everything should be done together and every room should be your together room. And, we maybe allow the guy a little man cave somewhere, but the woman doesn't have a woman cave, a she shed, right? Now we have she sheds. So having actually a place where your nervous system can relax and open and feel rested and the sensory overload go down and you feel good about the stuff that's in there and you're self-responsible like you were before you became part of a whole that also includes other people, independence and stuff like that, is therapeutically hugely important. And it's sexually hugely important. If you can say to your partner, your room or mine, you're in business.
There's something so that lands so naturally in that for me, because I often feel that the very skills and qualities that make us good matches, good partners romantically and intimately and sexually are antithetical to what makes us well matched to cohabitate. And it's similar to what you described when you compared and contrasted early dating and what makes the spark fresh and alive early with when you do a date night once you've been living together. It's like, the amount of complementary values and interests and the extent to which you must see the world in a symbiotic way to be compatible living together is antithetical to having amazing sex in many instances. And to expect one person to embody all of those things for you feels to me unrealistic.
I would 100% agree with you.
I wasn't sure because there was a pregnant pause.
No, I would 100% agree with you. And I often talk about the fact that what makes you good in relationship is directly opposite or oppositional to what makes you excited about sex with that person. And of course, the more you become the same, the less you have the difference for the spark. And so that's why spending time apart in whatever way that goes is what is the recipe for erotic. I call it erotic friction in my work. And so erotic friction is not everybody's thing, right? Some people are not, that's not where they want to live. And then that's fine, right? I always joke about the fact that, the people who become the same, so to speak, but who really love that are those couples you see in their matching terry cloth sweatsuits in their Winnebago on an RV parking lot in Arizona, right? And it works for them. They're really kind. They're really loving. They are holding hands, even though they've been married for 50 years. They are pretty much the same person, and it works for them. But they don't sit around and say, "Oh, I wish we would have, crazy wild sex." Maybe some of them do, and we do. There's things we don't know.
Maybe
some dungeon in the back of the RV, but
but I would bet that life is a little bit easier for them than they are for others who really seek out and want that amazing chemistry. They don't want to let it go. What they felt in the beginning is the reason they got together and stayed together, and they don't want to accept that it goes away. You have said that when partners feel sexual chemistry wane, that it's actually a sign of the relationship progressing positively. Why?
Well, for that reason, right? So in the beginning, you have two separate people. And, that beautiful heady time when you spend day and night on the phone or in person or whatever, and you talk about everything and you discover these, I always just joke about, you discover that you both have an obscure love of 16th century French love poetry or something like that, right? Like, oh my God, I had that once where it's like, oh, we were at the same movie premiere, many, many years before we knew each other. And you create this sameness, right? And that sameness makes it so you kind of start resonating with each other. And that resonance makes it so you can have a good relationship because now you have common values, common interests. You share certain values and views. Then, of course, the next thing that happens is you start meeting each other's friends, or you kind of create a circle of friends together. Now you share friends. Then you share a home, then you share children or a job or whatever. So suddenly everything becomes shared, and that sharing is the sign of relationship progressing. And so what makes a good relationship is sameness, including the ability, like you said, to be good cohabitants, to be good parents, to be good stewards of your house, your land, your business. And so that sameness is, when that happens first in a relationship, that means you're actually getting on the same page, which for a long-term, successful, sustainable relationship you need. But that very sameness makes it you no longer have the natural spark of attraction, which comes from the opposition, right? It's, what is it called? Birds of a feather flock together, right?
Yes.
And opposites attract.
Right.
And so birds of a feather flock together is what makes you have a good relationship. Opposite attracts is what makes you have good sex. Now, when the natural attraction wanes, you have entered birds of a feather domain, which is good for the relationship. But then the next step that a lot of people don't know about is that then you can learn how to essentially create that spark on demand whenever you want to. A lot of people think the spark is this magical thing that happens or doesn't happen, but it's actually just a series of behaviors that makes you go into opposition. All the things we talked about. Don't touch unless you want to touch. Don't talk about your regular, mundane, everyday stuff unless that's what you want your interaction to be like. Try something new, make an effort, make yourself interesting. Those are the things that anytime you want, produce the spark. Now, the problem is, it is that simple. It is, in fact, that simple. And I have had clients that I've had for years who would go into relationship and they would come very early before there was a problem and say, how are we going to remedy this? Right? And then you do things like you have regular meetings about your administrivia and you don't bring it into your evenings generally.
Right.
You have time away from your employees, children, whatever, right? So you can cultivate, the dynamics of spending time apart versus spending conscious time together. And you do that and you transition out of, that crazy spark that is there in the beginning because you are so separate and it's chemistry, to
Yep.
being able to create chemistry when you want to. And when you don't want it, you don't have to deal with it. Because the other option, and we all know people like that, is you fight like mad and then you have crazy makeup sex,
Right.
right? Which is essentially people who fundamentally can't make sameness happen.
Yeah.
But because of that, they have strong erotic friction. So they essentially are constantly in opposition. It doesn't work except for sex. And I know people who've been in those kind of relationships for years, and it's
Decades.
Yeah.
Decades.
toxic for everyone except them and for them, but they like it, right? And so,
Or they hate it and they don't know how to get out of it because they don't have the relationship skills to get out of it.
Exactly. And so I call it, you either have a relationship problem or you have an erotic friction problem. And the problem that a lot of therapists have, because it's not trained like that, is that when you go to a conventional therapist with an erotic friction problem, they often give you relationship fixes. And relationship fixes, of course, make the erotic friction problem worse.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a relationship problem, it's not understood that when you fix the relationship, the erotic friction will go down.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've never been so quiet in an interview because the words coming out of your mouth really reflect so many of my own beliefs. I don't think that people necessarily want to be caught in that terrible power struggle that overrides that center part of a relationship when people are, they're out of the honeymoon, but they're not in the mindful love stage, which is the promised land that we all want to get to. But I think that many people get really caught up in that because I think the most profound thing I've heard you say, and you've said many things that I find profound today, is this date night discipline. Because when partners are unprepared for that leakage, for the housekeeping leakage, you never know if your partner is hoping that tonight's going to be a seductive, sexy night where you're going to come together and have great sex. And in the absence of knowing that, if you accidentally leak some stuff into that space, particularly if it's a woman who your partner is, that's it. That's it. That's it. That's it. Her metaphoric erection is gone. And now the night is about this. Or it's just robbed her of that erotic energy. One of the ways that we bypass that now, we had many years where that was eroding our relationship. We have a family meeting once a week where we talk about housekeeping. And I try my damnedest not to leak or poison our personal space with bullshit. Because whether the bills got paid or not can wait for that meeting. And all the other questions I have, and I'm constantly wondering if every 30th thing that I've asked my wife to do has gotten done yet. And I have to have the discipline and the impulse control to wait for that meeting. And it really, at least on my part, it has controlled my big mouth, and it has helped me to, if one of us controls it, that's a big change in the relationship. If both of us can control it a little bit, it's even better. And once you get used to knowing that there's a consistent place to work that out, first of all, your anxiety about those questions goes down, and the backlog of those questions dissipates because you begin to roll through it all. And then it's only about current day questions that you have. It's not the 6 months worth of questions that you've kind of avoided asking your partner about until you're bursting at the seams or until they look like they're in a good mood. And by the way, their good mood is often because they were hoping to have sex that night. And then you spring the question on them that ruptures the connection that would otherwise be sexual.
Yeah, absolutely. And furthermore, right? I mean, even if you are the man in a relationship, the same thing happens. That questioning of one's competency is a total boner killer, right, so to speak. And this is something
You certainly spoke it.
I mean, there's no other way of saying this. It's true for both genders, right? It's like, it doesn't, it's a metaphorical and actual erection. It's like that feeling of just being deflated by the criticism or by the demand. It's either demand or criticism or both. That's not exciting at all. And one of the things that I've noticed recently, particularly, is that somehow it's to be expected that people, particularly in heterosexual couples, that men perform no matter how much they get, verbally or emotionally abused by their partners about what they haven't done. It's like, I mean, you can't possibly expect anyone to have an erection after they've been taken to task about not having taken the trash out. Yeah.
Which is why I highly recommend the family meeting, folks. It's a really great 1 hour. Get it out of the way when you're both sober. Sunlight is up. You both know it's coming, so it doesn't feel like an ambush. Family meeting. Different from a relationship meeting. I have one of those also where we talk about the relationship. Again, daylight hours, scheduled weekly. It's like in lieu of couples counseling when we're not in couples counseling. And I find that most healthy couples are in and out of couples counseling for the duration of the relationship. It's like having a car and not expecting to have a tune-up. I think it's completely unrealistic.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and I also very, very strongly, I do it myself, and I have meetings for everything, right? I think the more you can delineate things, the better. And also, I've even gone so far as given people very specific questions in their relationship meeting that they have to both answer or things like that. But also to add further to what you're saying is, if you need to talk about sex and your sexual life and things like that, don't ever, 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 because you said daylight hours, don't ever do it after sex or during sex or in the vicinity of where you have sex. You have to completely divorce it from the locus of your sexual activity and from the sexual activity yourself. Otherwise, your body starts reacting to the negative.
It starts linking up the negative feeling you had having the conversation to the proximity of the bedroom or the person, and also clothing on, right, for those conversations.
Absolutely.
Yeah, nothing makes you feel worse than being naked and talking about or hearing your partner talk about their unfulfilled sex life, even if you've just come out of the shower.
Yes.
And it has nothing to do with sex. You got to have your clothes on when you're talking about sex.
Yes.
Michaela, what is one thing that you do to maintain your mental health?
If it would be so easy, then just doing one thing.
Well, I wanted to allow you to have some privacy, so I figured maybe you give me a top level answer for that one.
Yeah. I'm partly joking, but I think the thing that I've realized because I have a very, very intense career and personal life, essentially is I have to do daily rituals. So it's not so much what I do, but that I do the same things every day, and that I have go-to things throughout the day that de-escalate my nervous system. And so I have, I'm very regimented when it comes to that stuff, where I have specific things I do at specific times throughout the day that allow me to always come back to myself. And there's simple things like having a cup of tea, journaling. I developed a movement method called the nonlinear movement method, which is exactly what it sounds like. If I would have known it gotten so big when I developed it, I would have called it something a bit snazzier. But
you can do a rebrand.
Yeah, I could do a rebrand, but not with as many teachers and modalities as there are out there. But it doesn't matter. But it's essentially exactly what it is. It's a system in which you move your body in very nonlinear ways to de-escalate the nervous system in a very specific way. And that is my go-to. If anything goes wrong, that is what I do. Meaning, there's drama, there's trauma, there's triggering, there is stress, there's turbulence on the plane, there's whatever. That is my go-to for need to tend to my system quickly. But my I would say my baseline is that my entire day has built-in rituals or built-in activities that always make me come back to myself, regardless of what it is. And I think of all the things I do, it's movement and tea.
I love that. I mean, and as a trauma trained therapist myself, and I'm sure you know this, but maybe our listeners don't. One of the best things we can do to protect from trauma is move. If an animal has a near-death experience in the wild, they will then, once they're away from the threat, they will shake for 10 to 30 seconds, and they don't suffer from trauma the way we do because we're so disciplined and we sit and we're taught to sit from the time we're 5 years old and be well-behaved and be sedentary, and the body needs to move or the body keeps the score, as you and I and every trauma-trained therapist knows.
Well, furthermore, also, we're not only asked to sit quietly, but it's always that don't cry, or even worse, people will try and comfort you out of crying, right? Or like shaking, crying, shivering, and stuff like that. So yes, we're completely arrested in our natural mechanisms, and coincidentally, the nonlinear movement method is about giving the authority back to the body to do what the body does best, which is de-escalate, wash things out, unfreeze, without you even having to emotionally or mentally process it in fine detail, because very often you don't know what gets you. And so that the kind of trust of yourself towards your body to do the de-escalation is a key part of all the work I do, but it's also a key part of how I keep myself from going nuts.
And we all need ways to not be nuts. I totally understand. I have enjoyed this conversation so much, Michaela. Where can people learn more about you or follow you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm assuming you will post my website, michaelaboehm.com, which, is spelled, well, I'm not going to spell it. You'll post it in the show notes anyway.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We Need to Talk with Dr. Darcy Sterling is a Sterling Standard production. Editing and sound engineering is by Bart Migal. Our theme music is by Trending Music. Special thanks to Amanda Cristiani and Preston Smith. We'll be back on Tuesday with another episode packed with the dating, relationship, and mental health hacks you have come to expect. References are always linked in the show notes.